The wildlife officer checked my fishing permit twice before looking back at the woman who reported me. She stood there with her arms folded beside the dock her neighborhood used every summer. She had spent 20 minutes explaining how I was stealing fish from a protected lake and damaging community property. Then the officer asked a simple question about stocking records. I handed him a binder from my truck. He opened it, read 2 pages, and his whole expression changed. That was the moment she realized the lake behind her subdivision existed because I had spent 12 years paying to maintain it. I own 180 acres outside a small mountain town in northern Tennessee. Most people around here know the land because of the lake sitting in the center of it. It covers almost 20 acres during a wet season and feeds into a narrow creek that runs south toward county land. My grandfather dug the original basin in the late 1970s. Back then, it was little more than a cattle pond. Over the years, my father expanded it with permits, drainage work, and state inspections. When the property passed to me, I kept the same routine. The lake was never public. But for years, nobody caused problems. The subdivision beside my north fence line arrived slowly. First came 3 vacation cabins, then paved roads, then a gated entrance with stone signs and decorative lights. By the time construction ended, nearly 40 homes sat along the ridge overlooking my water. Most neighbors were respectful. A few were not. The woman who started the trouble moved in during the previous spring. Her name was Linda Harper. She chaired the subdivision's new Lake Preservation Committee, despite the fact the subdivision did not own a single foot of the shoreline. At first, I assumed she simply misunderstood the property lines. That assumption cost me several months of peace. Most mornings on my property followed the same pattern. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and walked down the gravel path toward the east dock while the fog still sat low across the water. The lake stayed quiet at that hour. No boats, no voices, just birds moving through the reeds and the sound of water touching old cedar posts. I preferred it that way. The lake required constant work, even when everything looked calm from a distance. Every season brought something different. In spring, I monitored runoff levels and checked the spillway after storms. During summer, I treated invasive weeds before they spread into the deeper channels. Fall meant shoreline repairs and clearing dead timber. Winter was mostly equipment maintenance and permit renewals. People assumed a lake maintained itself. It did not. Every fish stocked into that water had paperwork attached to it. Every chemical treatment needed county approval. I kept records for everything because state wildlife inspectors occasionally reviewed private lake management operations. My father taught me early that land ownership meant very little without documentation. Most years, I stocked bass, bluegill, and catfish through a hatchery 2 counties away. I paid for delivery myself. The subdivision residents benefited from it whether they realized it or not. Fish moved downstream into connected water systems during flood seasons. Wildlife improved around the entire valley because the lake stayed healthy. I never charged anyone to fish there. That surprised people when they learned it later. For years, neighbors from nearby properties occasionally asked permission to use the shore for an afternoon. Families brought folding chairs and cleaned up afterward. Teenagers sometimes kayaked near the western bank during summer weekends. I had rules. No littering, no fires, no gas motors, no fishing without permission. Most people respected that. Linda Harper did not. The first time I noticed her, she was standing near my north dock with 2 other residents from the subdivision. They were placing small metal signs into the ground beside the shoreline. Private community access. I parked my truck and walked over calmly. Linda introduced herself like we had already met before. She explained the subdivision committee was improving lake organization for residents. Then she told me they planned to add benches and a kayak rack before summer. I remember looking directly at the sign before answering. I told her the shoreline belonged entirely to me. Her smile tightened for half a second. Then she informed me the subdivision map showed shared recreational access to the water. I asked to see the map. She said she would email it later. She never did. Instead, 3 days later, more signs appeared along my fence line. I removed the signs myself that evening. Not aggressively, not dramatically. I loaded each one into the bed of my truck, drove them to the subdivision entrance, and left them leaning carefully beside their decorative stone wall. Then I emailed the Homeowners Association president with copies of my property survey attached. The survey was clear. My north boundary extended 30 feet past the shoreline. The subdivision ended at the fence line installed years before construction even began. I assumed that would settle things. Instead, Linda escalated. 2 mornings later, I found orange spray paint markings across several trees near the dock area. Wooden stakes had been pushed into the soil every 20 feet. Someone had started measuring for a walking trail. That bothered me more than the signs. Signs could be removed quietly. Survey markings meant intention. I took photographs from multiple angles before touching anything. Then I walked the entire fence line and noticed fresh footprints leading through a damaged section near the northern corner. Somebody had bent the wire fencing down far enough to squeeze coolers and equipment through. I repaired it immediately. That afternoon, I received my first direct email from Linda. The message was written like a formal notice. She claimed the subdivision possessed historic recreational rights connected to the lake because residents had used the area openly for years. She also accused me of creating unsafe barriers that restricted community enjoyment of a natural resource. Natural resource. That phrase appeared 3 different times. I answered politely. I attached county parcel maps, tax records, and shoreline maintenance permits registered under my family's name dating back almost 20 years. I explained there were no public easements on the property and no recorded access agreements with the subdivision. Her reply came 20 minutes later. She said the matter would be reviewed by the committee. That was when I understood the problem had little to do with confusion. Linda believed repetition created authority. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation became stranger. Subdivision residents started appearing near the lake almost daily. Some stayed respectful and left when asked. Others acted like they already owned the shoreline. One family dragged kayaks through the damaged fence opening despite seeing fresh repair wire installed the day before. I stayed calm each time. I documented everything: photos, dates, vehicle plates, conversations. Then came the first real violation. I returned from town one Saturday afternoon and found 6 people fishing from my eastern dock. Beer cans sat beside folding chairs. One teenager had tied a rope swing to a cypress branch hanging over shallow water. Linda stood near the shoreline directing people where to park. She saw my truck and immediately crossed her arms. I walked down slowly and asked everyone to leave the property. Most people avoided eye contact and started gathering their things. Linda did not move. Instead, she told me the subdivision had voted to establish community lake access privileges until the ownership dispute could be resolved. There was no ownership dispute, and she knew it. I told Linda she needed to leave the property immediately. My voice stayed calm. I did not threaten anyone. I simply explained that the land was private and that I had already provided documentation proving ownership. She smiled like the conversation amused her. Then she said something I wrote down later that night, word for word. Nobody owns a lake. Several residents looked uncomfortable after she said it. One older man quietly packed his tackle box and apologized while walking past me. A younger couple followed him toward the trail opening near the fence. Linda stayed where she was. So did 2 committee members standing behind her. I informed them that future trespassing complaints would be filed directly with the county sheriff's office. That finally got their attention. One of the men muttered something about taking this to the HOA attorney, and they eventually left with the others. The entire shoreline looked terrible afterward. Fishing line hung from branches. Empty cans sat near the dock supports. Somebody had driven ATV tracks across a section of wet grass near the spillway access road. I spent nearly 2 hours cleaning the area before sunset. The next morning, I installed trail cameras along the north boundary. Not hidden cameras, visible ones. I wanted people to know documentation existed. 3 days later, the cameras captured subdivision residents cutting through the repaired fence again just after dawn. One man carried coolers. Another pulled a wagon loaded with fishing equipment. At 7:14 a.m., Linda appeared behind them holding coffee and pointing toward the western bank. I saved every file onto 2 separate hard drives. Then I contacted the county property office and requested certified copies of every survey and parcel transfer connected to the land since my grandfather bought it. If this eventually reached court, I wanted complete records ready beforehand. Around the same time, I learned something else. The subdivision's promotional brochures had advertised exclusive lake community living during early home sales years before Linda arrived. Technically, the brochures never claimed ownership of the lake itself, but the wording was vague enough to mislead buyers unfamiliar with county maps. That explained why some residents honestly believed they had access rights. Linda used that confusion constantly. A week later, I received a certified letter from the Homeowners Association attorney. The letter demanded that I remove fencing that restricted traditional community access and requested mediation regarding shared environmental stewardship. The wording sounded impressive. Legally, it meant almost nothing. My attorney reviewed the letter the same afternoon. He laughed once while reading it, then became serious again. He advised me not to engage emotionally and to continue documenting every interaction. That advice mattered later, because Linda's next move crossed far beyond signs and emails. One Friday evening, I arrived home and noticed dozens of small floating objects scattered across the northern side of the lake. At first, I thought debris had washed in after rain. Then I got closer. Bread, corn, buckets of fish feed. Someone had dumped massive amounts of cheap feed directly into shallow spawning areas. And standing near the dock, taking pictures for social media, was Linda Harper. I knew immediately how bad the situation could become. People unfamiliar with lake management think feeding fish is harmless. In small amounts, sometimes it is. But dumping random feed into spawning zones during summer heat can damage water quality fast. Uneaten food decays, oxygen levels drop, algae spreads. I walked straight toward Linda and asked what she was doing. She held up her phone without lowering it. "Helping the fish population?" she said. Around her, 3 subdivision residents scattered more bread across the water while children tossed handfuls of corn from the dock. One of them had opened a 50-pound livestock feed bag beside the shoreline. I told everyone to stop immediately. Linda answered by saying the lake belonged to the ecosystem, not to me. Then she accused me of hoarding natural resources from the community. That phrase spread quickly after that day. Within a week, subdivision Facebook groups started discussing my property like I was some wealthy outsider controlling public land. Never mind the fact my family had owned it for decades before the subdivision existed. Never mind the tax records, permits, maintenance bills, or state inspections. Facts moved slower than outrage. I collected water samples the next morning and contacted the environmental consultant I normally use during algae season. He confirmed elevated nutrient levels near the northern shoreline where the feed had been dumped. I added the report to my records binder. Then things became more deliberate. The subdivision committee installed a wooden message board near their entrance. Every weekend, new notices appeared describing community lake restoration efforts. Residents organized shoreline cleanups on land they did not own. One flyer announced plans for a future fishing tournament on my property. I documented every sign, every flyer, every social media post. I still avoided confrontation whenever possible, but Linda wanted confrontation. One afternoon, I found bright survey tape tied along trees near my western bank. Spray-painted arrows pointed toward a flat clearing beside the water. A stack of lumber sat nearby covered with a tarp. That evening, trail camera footage showed 2 committee members unloading picnic tables from a trailer after dark. They intended to build a permanent gathering area before I could stop them. I drove down there immediately. The men froze when my headlights hit the clearing. Neither expected me to arrive that late. I stepped out calmly and informed them they were trespassing and damaging private land. One man apologized almost instantly. The other called Linda. She arrived 20 minutes later in a golf cart from the subdivision trail entrance. What struck me most was not her anger. It was her confidence. Linda spoke like someone convinced rules only applied to other people. She informed me the committee had already contacted state environmental contacts regarding my control of the lake. Then she warned me I should cooperate before outside agencies became involved. I remember looking at the unfinished picnic tables behind her while she talked. Every board, every tool, every vehicle, all sitting illegally on my property. Yet she behaved as if I were the unreasonable one. That night, after everyone finally left, I added another camera overlooking the western clearing. By then, I understood something important. Linda no longer cared whether she was legally correct. She cared about appearing publicly correct long enough to pressure me into surrendering access. The pressure campaign became organized after that. Subdivision residents started treating the lake like disputed territory instead of private land. More people crossed the damaged fence each weekend. Some acted polite when confronted. Others filmed me openly with their phones while I worked near the shoreline. I never reacted emotionally. That frustrated Linda more than anything else. She wanted an argument she could post online. Instead, every interaction ended the same way. I calmly informed people they were trespassing. I documented the encounter. Then I contacted either the homeowners association or the sheriff's office, depending on the situation. The sheriff deputies understood the issue almost immediately. County records were clear. The property lines were not complicated. But because the subdivision residents usually left before deputies arrived, enforcement stayed limited to warnings during those early weeks. Linda used that delay carefully. She began telling residents the county was still reviewing ownership questions. That was false. No review existed. But repeating uncertainty helped her maintain support inside the subdivision. Then came the docks. I noticed the first one early on a Sunday morning. Someone had dragged a lightweight floating platform into a narrow cove near the northern bank and anchored it between two trees. A small ladder hung off the side. Plastic chairs sat on top beside a cooler. By noon, social media photos from the subdivision showed families swimming from it, on my property. I photographed everything before removing the platform with my workboat and storing it beside my equipment shed. 2 days later, another appeared farther west, then another. The message was obvious. They intended to establish constant physical presence around the shoreline faster than I could remove it. My attorney finally sent formal cease and desist notices to both the Homeowners Association and Linda personally. The notices included photographs, survey records, camera timestamps, and references to Tennessee trespassing statutes. Linda responded online within hours. She posted that wealthy landowners were attempting to intimidate local families from accessing shared environmental spaces. Several residents repeated the claim without checking facts. That bothered me less than what happened next. One evening, I found fresh tire ruts running directly across the spillway service road. Heavy vehicles had driven through a restricted drainage area protected under state maintenance guidelines. The ground near one concrete overflow channel had partially collapsed from the weight. Repairing that damage cost nearly $4,000. The contractor handling the repairs asked the obvious question: "Who keeps coming onto your land?" By then, everyone nearby knew the answer. The trail cameras caught the entire incident clearly. 2 side-by-side utility vehicles entered through the damaged north fence shortly after midnight, carrying several subdivision residents. Linda rode in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. At one point, she even pointed toward the spillway gate while speaking to the driver. I backed up the footage immediately. Then I received the first official notice from state wildlife authorities. A complaint had been filed accusing me of illegally restricting access to protected recreational waters and potentially violating fishery regulations connected to the lake. Linda had done exactly what she threatened. She brought outside authorities into it. What she did not understand was that every single fishery document connected to that lake carried my name. The wildlife notice arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I read it twice at my kitchen table while rain moved across the lake outside the window. The complaint accused me of interfering with public access to stocked fishing waters and possibly conducting unauthorized fish management activities. That last accusation caught my attention immediately. Unauthorized fish management carried real penalties if records were missing. Mine were not missing. I walked into my office and started pulling binders from the storage shelves my father installed years earlier. Every lake expense had been documented for over a decade. Water testing reports, state permits, spillway inspections, fish stocking invoices, habitat management consultations, chemical treatment approvals. I organized everything chronologically across the dining room table. By midnight, I had assembled nearly 15 years of records. The next morning, I contacted the regional wildlife office directly instead of waiting for investigators to arrive. I requested the names of the officers assigned to the complaint and offered complete access to the property and documentation. That changed the tone immediately. People hiding violations usually avoided scrutiny. I invited it. Over the following week, I shifted almost entirely into evidence management mode. Cameras were upgraded along every access point. Fence repairs were photographed before and after installation. I began carrying a small body camera whenever I worked near the shoreline. Not for drama, for clarity. Memory becomes unreliable once lawyers and public accusations get involved. Video does not. My attorney also advised me to stop verbal discussions with subdivision residents entirely, unless necessary. From then on, every communication went through email or certified mail whenever possible. Linda did not adapt well to that. Without emotional reactions to provoke, she became louder publicly. Her online posts grew more aggressive. She accused me of weaponizing paperwork against families and privatizing nature for profit. Profit. That word appeared often despite the fact I never charged anyone to use the lake before all this started. Then came the petition. Subdivision residents began circulating documents demanding county intervention over community water access rights. Linda posted photos beside the lake holding stacks of signatures like she was running a political campaign. What she failed to mention was that nearly half the signatures came from people living nowhere near the property. One afternoon, an older resident named Carl approached me quietly while I repaired fencing near the eastern road. He lived in the subdivision but had stayed out of the conflict until then. He looked uncomfortable. Carl explained that several homeowners had started questioning Linda privately. Some worried the homeowners association was spending money on legal fights it could not win. Others were angry after learning the subdivision brochures never actually guaranteed lake access. Then Carl told me something important. Linda had already hired contractors to design a permanent community dock system. Not near the lake, on the lake. She planned to force the issue physically before authorities completed their investigation. That conversation changed my approach completely. Until then, I had focused mostly on defense, documentation, repairs, legal responses. After speaking with Carl, I realized Linda believed speed would overwhelm process. She intended to create visible community infrastructure on my shoreline and pressure officials into accepting it afterward. So I began preparing for the next stage carefully, because once construction equipment entered my property, the situation would no longer remain a neighborhood dispute. It would become criminal trespassing with financial damages attached. I spent the next several days preparing quietly. First, I met with my attorney and a county surveyor at the property line near the subdivision entrance. We walked the entire northern boundary together while the surveyor verified every marker installed over the years. New photographs were taken. GPS coordinates were logged. Updated maps were certified and signed. Then I installed temporary orange construction fencing along the most frequently used access points. Not because the old fence failed, because I wanted future violations impossible to misunderstand. Private property, no trespassing, authorized access only. I placed the signs every 50 feet. At the same time, the wildlife officers scheduled their inspection visit for the following Tuesday morning. I prepared for that like an audit. Every permit was organized into labeled folders. Receipts from hatcheries were matched with stocking schedules. Water quality reports sat beside treatment invoices and habitat diagrams. When Tuesday arrived, 2 officers drove onto the property just after sunrise. Both were professional from the beginning. I appreciated that. One of them introduced himself as Officer Bennett. The other carried a field notebook and spent most of the morning reviewing shoreline conditions while I answered questions about stocking procedures. The inspection lasted nearly 4 hours. They checked spillway permits, fish habitat zones, feeding restrictions, stocking records, water quality logs, even sediment control reports from previous years. I gave them everything. At one point, Officer Bennett stopped flipping through a binder and looked at me carefully. "You've maintained all this personally?" I told him my family always had. He nodded slowly after that. Before leaving, the officers requested copies of recent trail camera footage connected to the trespassing complaints. I provided external hard drives containing organized video folders sorted by date and camera location. Again, I wanted complete transparency. That afternoon, word spread through the subdivision that wildlife officers had visited the lake. Linda immediately posted online claiming state authorities were investigating environmental misuse by the landowner. Technically true, but deeply misleading. By then, several residents had started doubting her version of events openly. Carl later told me homeowners were asking uncomfortable questions during HOA meetings. Legal expenses kept growing, yet no official agency had supported Linda's claims publicly. That uncertainty made her more aggressive. 3 nights later, my Western Trail camera captured headlights entering the property shortly after midnight. A pickup truck towing construction equipment crossed through the damaged fence opening near the old service road. Behind it came Linda's golf cart. I watched the footage 3 times the next morning. Workers unloaded lumber, concrete forms, and dock floats near the western shoreline clearing where the picnic tables had first appeared weeks earlier. At 1:42 a.m., Linda pointed toward the water while speaking with the contractor. Then the workers started digging post holes. On my land. Without permits. Without permission. I called my attorney immediately. His answer was direct. Do not confront them alone. Instead, he contacted the sheriff's office while I copied every video file onto additional storage drives. By sunrise, deputies were already heading toward the property. What happened next finally pushed the situation beyond neighborhood politics and into official enforcement territory. Because the contractors arrived back that morning expecting another normal workday. They did not expect marked patrol vehicles waiting beside the shoreline. I arrived at the western shoreline just after the deputies. 3 patrol vehicles blocked the narrow service road leading toward the clearing. The contractors stood beside their equipment looking confused while one deputy reviewed paperwork near the truck bed. Linda was already arguing when I stepped out of my truck. She pointed toward the lake repeatedly while insisting the subdivision possessed community recreational rights connected to environmental access. One deputy listened patiently for several minutes before asking a simple question. Do you have documentation showing ownership or easement rights? Linda started talking about historical usage patterns instead. That answer did not help her. I handed the deputies updated survey maps along with certified county records confirming the property boundaries. My attorney had emailed additional copies directly to the sheriff's office earlier that morning. The difference in preparation became obvious immediately. Linda had opinions. I had records. The contractors looked increasingly uncomfortable once deputies explained they were currently operating on private property without authorization. One foreman quietly admitted they had been told the homeowners association already secured approval for the work. They had not. Deputies ordered all equipment removed from the shoreline pending further review. The partially dug post holes were photographed as property damage evidence before the contractors left. Linda reacted badly after that. She accused me of manipulating local officials because my family had lived in the county for decades. Then she claimed I was trying to monopolize the lake against community interests. One deputy finally interrupted her calmly. Ma'am, property law isn't determined by committee votes. That line spread through town faster than anything else. By evening, several residents had already heard about the failed dock project and sheriff involvement. The subdivision Facebook pages became chaotic. Some homeowners defended Linda aggressively. Others demanded explanations regarding legal expenses and unauthorized construction plans. Meanwhile, I focused on repairs again. The contractors had damaged shoreline vegetation while unloading materials, and deep tire ruts cut through a drainage section near the western cove. I documented everything carefully before beginning cleanup. 2 days later, the wildlife officers returned. This time, the atmosphere felt very different. Officer Bennett informed me they had completed their preliminary review of the complaint file. None of the accusations regarding illegal fish stocking or environmental violations were supported by evidence. In fact, several records I provided exceeded normal private lake management standards. Then he asked about the subdivision conflict directly. I explained the entire situation from the beginning while showing him trail footage, property surveys, attorney letters, and repair invoices connected to repeated trespassing incidents. He watched quietly for almost an hour. At one point, we paused near the eastern dock where children from nearby families used to fish peacefully years earlier before all this began. Bennett looked across the water toward the subdivision ridge. Then he asked a question that surprised me. Have these people been fishing here regularly? I told him yes, quite regularly. He nodded once and wrote something in his notebook. I did not understand the significance of that question until later, because while Linda spent months trying to convince authorities the lake belonged to the public, she overlooked one critical fact. Every fish stocked into that water system had been purchased, transported, documented, and managed under permits carrying my name alone, and state wildlife officers took those records very seriously. The next escalation came from Linda herself. Saturday morning, just after sunrise, I drove down toward the eastern dock carrying replacement boards for a section damaged during the earlier trespassing incidents. Before I even reached the shoreline, I noticed 3 unfamiliar trucks parked near the north fence opening. State Wildlife Enforcement. 2 uniformed officers stood beside the dock speaking with Linda, while several subdivision residents watched from folding chairs nearby. Fishing poles leaned against coolers. Someone had clearly planned a public scene. Linda spotted my truck immediately. She folded her arms with the same confident expression she always used before creating trouble. One officer approached me calmly and explained they received another complaint alleging illegal restriction of public fishing waters and possible interference with protected fish populations. I recognized Officer Bennett's partner from the earlier inspection. His expression already suggested he understood exactly what was happening. Still, procedure required them to investigate the active complaint. I cooperated fully. Again. Linda interrupted repeatedly while the officers spoke with me. She claimed the lake had become a community-supported ecosystem because local residents used it regularly. Then she accused me of threatening people who tried to fish there. None of that matched the reports already on file. The officers eventually asked everyone to remain quiet while they reviewed documentation. I walked back to my truck and retrieved the large binder containing stocking permits, hatchery invoices, maintenance contracts, and inspection reports. Linda laughed softly when she saw the binder. That reaction disappeared within minutes. Officer Bennett opened directly to the stocking records section and began reviewing permit numbers aloud with his partner. Every delivery date matched state registration records. Every species introduction carried authorization paperwork. Even supplemental habitat installations had inspection approvals attached. The entire lake management history sat organized in front of them. Then Bennett asked the question that changed everything. Who paid for all fish stocking operations on this lake? I answered simply. My family did. He flipped through several more pages before asking another question. Any state stocking programs involved? No. He looked over toward Linda after that. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, Bennett closed the binder and addressed the group standing near the dock. This is a privately managed lake system, he said. The fish populations here are maintained through documented private stocking operations. Linda immediately interrupted. But people fish here all the time. Bennett nodded once. Then he delivered the sentence that froze the entire shoreline. That does not create public access rights. It means you've been fishing in a privately stocked lake without owner authorization. Nobody spoke after that. Several subdivision residents slowly lowered their fishing rods. One man quietly started packing equipment back into his truck. Another asked whether they could face citations. The officers answered honestly. Potentially, yes, especially after repeated trespassing notices and documented warnings. Linda's face changed completely at that moment. For the first time since this began, her confidence cracked publicly. She tried shifting the conversation back toward community usage traditions, but the officers were no longer interested in theories or committee claims. They cared about permits, ownership, records, actual law. Before leaving, Officer Bennett advised all subdivision residents to avoid entering the property until the ongoing legal dispute concluded. Then he handed me a copy of the completed inspection summary. No violations found. As the patrol trucks drove away, the shoreline became completely silent. Linda stood beside the dock, staring at the water her committee had spent months claiming belonged to everyone. The problem was simple. The state had just confirmed it legally belonged to me. I thought the wildlife inspection would finally end things. Instead, it cornered Linda. And cornered people often make reckless decisions. For about a week, the subdivision stayed unusually quiet. Fewer residents approached the shoreline. Social media posts slowed down. Even the damaged fence areas remained untouched for several days. Then Carl called me late one evening. His voice sounded nervous. He explained the homeowners association held a closed meeting earlier that night. According to him, several residents wanted the conflict finished immediately after the wildlife officers publicly confirmed the lake was private. Linda refused. Instead, she blamed the outcome on county favoritism and claimed the subdivision needed stronger evidence showing the lake functioned as a shared public resource. Then Carl told me the important part. Linda planned to organize a large community fishing day the following weekend specifically to provoke another confrontation in front of cameras. This time she intended to invite local media pages and online community groups. I thanked Carl and ended the call. Then I contacted my attorney. His response surprised me. Let them come. At first I thought he meant we should simply document another trespassing incident, but he explained something carefully over the phone. Up until now, most violations involved scattered individuals, confusing subdivision claims, and arguments about access assumptions. But if Linda publicly organized a coordinated event after repeated legal notices, sheriff warnings, and wildlife enforcement clarification, the situation changed completely. It became intentional, deliberate, much easier to prove in court, so we prepared quietly. Additional cameras were installed near every shoreline entrance. My attorney coordinated directly with the sheriff's office beforehand and shared copies of prior warnings, inspection summaries, and property records. We also hired an independent videographer to document the entire property condition before the event. Meanwhile, Linda advertised aggressively online. Her flyers described the gathering as a peaceful community fishing demonstration. She encouraged residents to reclaim shared natural resources and promised there would be official observers present. There were, just not the observers she expected. Saturday morning arrived warm and clear. By 8 a.m., vehicles already lined the subdivision entrance road. Families carried coolers, folding chairs, fishing poles, and kayaks toward the north fence opening. I stayed near the eastern dock, quietly watching from a distance. No shouting, no confrontation, just observation. By mid-morning, more than 40 people had crossed onto the property. Some honestly looked uncertain. Others acted openly defiant after seeing cameras recording from shoreline poles. Then Linda arrived carrying a portable speaker and stack of printed flyers. She positioned herself near the main dock area like she was hosting a public event. Several people started fishing almost immediately. Children ran along the shoreline while adults filmed social media videos discussing community rights. My attorney stood beside me reviewing timestamps on his phone. Everything was being documented. Then, just after 10 a.m., sheriff vehicles appeared at both property entrances simultaneously. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Several residents lowered fishing rods and looked toward Linda expecting instructions. But Linda looked stunned, because she finally realized something too late. This was no longer a neighborhood disagreement she could control through confidence and public pressure. Now it was an organized trespassing event with dozens of witnesses, recorded evidence, prior official warnings, and law enforcement already prepared before anyone arrived. And every single person there had walked directly into it on camera. The deputies handled the situation carefully. No yelling, no dramatic arrests, just procedure. Sheriff vehicles blocked the trail openings while deputies walked shoreline sections documenting everyone present. Another officer recorded video near the dock where Linda had organized the gathering. My attorney stayed beside me the entire time. That mattered later, because nobody could claim I provoked the confrontation personally. Linda tried taking control immediately. She stepped toward the deputies holding printed flyers and explaining the event was a peaceful community demonstration. She insisted residents believe they possessed lawful access rights based on years of lake usage and subdivision representations. One deputy listened politely before asking whether she received prior trespassing notices. She hesitated. That pause said enough. The deputy then referenced earlier wildlife enforcement findings confirming the lake remained privately owned and privately stocked. He also mentioned the failed dock construction incident already documented in county reports. Several residents nearby started looking uncomfortable after hearing that, especially when deputies began collecting identification information from everyone actively fishing. A younger couple quietly packed their equipment and left almost immediately. Others followed once they realized official citations were possible. Within 30 minutes, nearly half the crowd had disappeared back toward the subdivision trails. Linda stayed. So did several committee members. Unfortunately for them, the cameras captured everything clearly. At one point, a deputy asked Linda directly whether she organized the event, despite prior warnings restricting access to the property. She answered yes. Then she attempted to justify it by describing the gathering as civil environmental action. My attorney actually wrote that phrase down. By noon, deputies finished documenting the scene and informed remaining residents they needed to leave the property immediately or face criminal trespassing charges. Most complied without argument. Linda did not. She demanded written proof that the sheriff's office possessed authority to remove people from shared ecological areas. One deputy calmly responded by pointing toward the certified property survey already attached to his clipboard. Then he asked her again to leave. She refused a second time. The citation process started after that. Watching her expression change while deputies completed the paperwork remains one of the quietest moments of the entire ordeal. Not dramatic, not explosive, just slow realization settling across her face while the reality finally became unavoidable. Paperwork mattered, warnings mattered, law mattered, and none of her public speeches changed those facts. Before leaving, deputies informed Linda and several committee members that additional complaints related to property damage and organized trespassing would likely move into civil court review soon. That statement spread through the subdivision faster than anything before it. Over the next week, homeowners association tensions exploded internally. Carl later told me emergency meetings lasted hours. Residents argued about legal exposure, attorney costs, and declining property values connected to the ongoing conflict. Some homeowners blamed Linda openly now. Others blamed the original developers for misleading advertising years earlier. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on evidence organization. Every citation report, every video file, every repair invoice, every online post encouraging trespassing. My attorney compiled everything into chronological timelines supported by certified county documents and wildlife inspection summaries. Then another discovery changed the case completely. During records review, my attorney uncovered emails showing Linda already knew the lake was private months before organizing the public demonstrations. She had received the county parcel maps directly and ignored them. That transformed the situation from misunderstanding into deliberate misconduct. Exactly what we needed before court. The emails changed everything. Until then, Linda publicly framed herself as a community advocate fighting a confusing property dispute. Some residents still believed she simply misunderstood the law or trusted inaccurate subdivision information. The emails destroyed that defense completely. One message from nearly 6 months earlier included attached county parcel maps, clearly outlining my shoreline ownership. Another contained direct warnings from the Homeowners Association attorney, advising Linda not to encourage residents onto the property without permission. She ignored both. Worse, she continued organizing events afterward while publicly claiming ownership remained uncertain. My attorney filed the documents into the civil complaint package immediately. News spread through the subdivision within days. Not because I posted anything online, because homeowners started demanding financial transparency from the HOA board once legal exposure became obvious. Residents wanted to know how much association money had already been spent on attorney consultations, unauthorized construction plans, and enforcement disputes. The numbers were not small. Carl later told me several board members privately tried distancing themselves from Linda as soon as the emails surfaced. But by then, too much documentation already existed connecting the committee directly to the trespassing campaign. Then local media pages found the story. Small county news sites first, then regional community forums. The headline most people shared focused on one detail above everything else. HOA organized fishing event on private stocked lake after official warnings. The wildlife officer's statements made the story impossible for Linda to spin effectively anymore. Screenshots of inspection summaries circulated online beside copies of my stocking permits and county records. Public opinion shifted fast after that. People understood something simple immediately. This was never about protecting nature. It was about forcing access onto somebody else's property through pressure and intimidation. Reporters contacted me repeatedly for comments. I declined most interviews. The few statements I gave stayed short and factual. I explained that my family maintained the lake privately for decades and that I simply wanted the law respected like anyone else would. Nothing more. Linda handled publicity very differently. She posted long, emotional videos accusing county officials, attorneys, and wealthy rural landowners of suppressing community rights. But the videos often contradicted documented evidence already circulating publicly. That hurt her credibility badly, especially after one local reporter obtained copies of the failed dock construction invoices tied directly to HOA funds. Subdivision residents became furious after learning association money had financed unauthorized building plans on private property. Emergency HOA meetings turned hostile. Several homeowners demanded Linda resign from the committee entirely. She refused. Instead, she doubled down publicly again. That decision became another mistake, because during one live-stream discussion defending herself online, Linda accidentally confirmed she knew the lake remained privately stocked before organizing the mass fishing event. My attorney saved the recording immediately. By then, the civil case was growing stronger almost weekly. Trespassing, property damage, fence destruction, unauthorized construction attempts, defamation claims tied to false public accusations, and now evidence showing deliberate misconduct after receiving direct legal warnings. The county court eventually scheduled the first hearing for late October. As the date approached, one thing became increasingly obvious across town. Linda had spent months trying to pressure me publicly into surrendering the lake. Instead, she had documented herself step by step into a courtroom she was no longer prepared to enter. The weeks before court felt strangely quiet, not peaceful, just restrained. Subdivision activity near the lake almost disappeared after the citations and media coverage. The damaged fence areas stayed untouched for the first time in months. Even online discussions slowed once homeowners realized every public statement could eventually appear in court filings. I spent most of that period restoring the property. Contractors repaired erosion damage near the spillway road. New fencing replaced older sections repeatedly cut during the summer. Along the western shoreline, I removed remaining construction debris connected to the failed dock project. The lake itself slowly returned to normal. That mattered to me more than the legal fight. One cold morning near the end of October, I walked down to the eastern dock before sunrise like I used to before all this began. Fog drifted across the water again. The shoreline stayed silent except for birds moving through the reeds. For the first time in months, nobody stood near the fence arguing about ownership. Then my phone rang. My attorney. He informed me Linda's legal team had requested settlement discussions before the first hearing. According to him, several HOA board members were pushing aggressively to reduce financial exposure before the court reviewed the evidence publicly. I asked what the proposal involved. The answer was simple. They wanted the property damage claims reduced and certain trespassing complaints dropped in exchange for ending the dispute quietly. I declined immediately. Not because I wanted revenge, because the issue had already moved beyond private inconvenience. Months of deliberate trespassing occurred after repeated warnings. Property damage costs were real. False accusations triggered official investigations, and dozens of residents had been encouraged publicly to violate property law based on claims Linda already knew were false. Quiet settlements would not fix that. My attorney agreed, especially after another development surfaced days later. During pretrial discovery, financial records showed HOA funds had been used not only for dock planning and legal consultations, but also for social media promotion related to the community fishing demonstration. That mattered legally. It connected the homeowners association directly to organized trespassing activities rather than isolated resident behavior. Several board members reportedly panicked after learning those records would likely appear during court review. 2 resigned before the hearing even started. Linda still refused to step down. She continued insisting the case represented community resistance against land monopolization. But outside the subdivision, fewer people took the argument seriously anymore. The evidence was too organized, too consistent, too documented. Then the court date finally arrived. I remember walking into the county courthouse carrying the same binder wildlife officers reviewed months earlier beside the lake. My attorney carried additional boxes containing photographs, repair invoices, video timestamps, certified surveys, inspection reports, and archived online statements. Linda entered from the opposite hallway with several HOA representatives behind her. For the first time since this began, she avoided eye contact completely. Because by then, the fight was no longer about public confidence or neighborhood politics. Inside that courtroom, only documented facts mattered, and almost every documented fact favored me. The courtroom itself was smaller than most people would imagine. No dramatic audience, no television cameras, just county officials, attorneys, HOA representatives, and several residents sitting quietly along wooden benches behind the rail. The judge began with property ownership first. That part moved quickly. Certified surveys, parcel records, tax filings, shoreline permits, and historical transfer documents all confirmed the same thing. My family owned the lake and surrounding shoreline continuously for decades before the subdivision existed. Linda's attorney did not seriously challenge ownership after reviewing the records. Instead, they shifted toward implied access arguments. They claimed long-term community use created reasonable public expectations connected to the lake. They referenced old subdivision advertising language in prior years when residents occasionally fished there without confrontation. My attorney answered simply, "Permission is not surrender of ownership." That distinction became central to the entire case. The court then reviewed evidence chronologically. Trail camera footage appeared first. Video after video showed residents crossing damaged fences, transporting equipment onto the property, and organizing shoreline gatherings after written warnings had already been issued. The failed dock construction footage drew particular attention from the judge because contractors clearly unloaded materials directly onto private land late at night. Then came the wildlife investigation records. Officer Bennett testified calmly for nearly 40 minutes. He explained the lake operated as a privately managed stocked fishery maintained under documented permits and inspections. He also confirmed no evidence supported accusations against me regarding environmental misuse or illegal management practices. At one point, the judge asked directly whether public fishing activity created ownership or access rights under state wildlife regulations. Bennett answered clearly, "No, Your Honor." The courtroom stayed very quiet after that. Next came the emails. My attorney introduced printed copies showing Linda received parcel maps and legal warnings months before organizing public demonstrations and fishing events. One email from the HOA attorney explicitly advised against encouraging residents onto the property. The judge spent several minutes reading that document personally. Linda's expression changed again while he did. Then my attorney played excerpts from her live stream statements and public social media posts, encouraging residents to reclaim the lake, despite official warnings already issued by both wildlife officers and sheriff deputies. The timeline became impossible to ignore. Warning after warning, notice after notice, and escalation after each one. Linda finally testified late in the afternoon. Her argument focused mostly on fairness rather than law. She described the lake as a shared environmental resource, benefiting the entire surrounding community. She claimed residents honestly believed access existed because previous owners rarely enforced restrictions aggressively. Some of that was probably true, but it stopped mattering once documented warnings began. The judge pointed that out directly. He asked whether she continued organizing events after receiving official confirmation the property remained private. She admitted yes. Then he asked whether she encouraged residents onto the land after sheriff warnings and wildlife findings clarified ownership. Again, yes. That admission changed the atmosphere completely. Because the case no longer centered on misunderstanding, it centered on deliberate disregard for documented law. Court recessed shortly before evening with final rulings scheduled for the following morning. As people filtered slowly out of the courtroom, several HOA residents avoided looking at Linda entirely. The confidence she carried beside the lake months earlier was gone by then. All that remained were records, and records rarely care about public opinion. The judge delivered the ruling the next morning just after 9 a.m. He began by stating clearly that no ambiguity existed regarding ownership of the lake or surrounding shoreline. County records, historical transfers, wildlife permits, and tax filings all confirmed continuous private ownership by my family. Then he addressed the larger issue directly. Repeated public use did not erase property rights. Permission given casually over past years did not create permanent community access, and homeowners associations could not manufacture easements through votes, signs, or organized pressure campaigns. The court found Linda and several HOA representatives liable for coordinated trespassing and property damage connected to the dock project, fence destruction, and unauthorized events. Financial judgments covered repair costs, legal expenses, environmental restoration work, and additional penalties tied to deliberate misconduct after formal warnings. The HOA itself also faced serious consequences. Because association funds had been used knowingly to support unauthorized construction plans and organized trespassing activities, the court ordered financial disclosures and imposed restrictions on future HOA actions involving neighboring private land. Then came the injunction, permanent. No subdivision resident could enter the property or access the lake without direct written permission from me moving forward. Future violations would trigger immediate enforcement authority without additional warnings. The judge's final comments stayed with me afterward. He said communities function only when people respect boundaries, even when they dislike them. Ownership, he explained, carries responsibilities but also protections under the law. Without those protections, conflict eventually replaces trust. Linda said very little after the ruling. Her attorney spoke quietly with HOA board members near the hallway, while residents left the courthouse one by one. Several looked exhausted more than angry. Months of legal fees, public attention, and internal fighting had drained the entire subdivision. I almost felt sorry for some of them. Almost. Outside the courthouse, local reporters waited for statements. I kept mine brief again. I said the matter should have ended the moment official records confirmed the property boundaries months earlier. Nothing more. Over the following weeks, the aftermath moved quickly. Linda resigned from the HOA committee under pressure from residents. 2 additional board members stepped down shortly afterward. The subdivision removed all online references suggesting community lake access, and attorneys issued corrections related to earlier public claims. Most importantly, the lake finally became quiet again. No crowds, no arguments, no strangers crossing fences with fishing gear, just water, trees, and the same shoreline my family maintained long before any subdivision existed nearby. Winter arrived early that year. One morning I stood alone near the eastern dock watching fog drift across the water exactly the way it used to before the conflict started. The repaired shoreline grass had finally grown back near the spillway road. New fencing stood clean along the north boundary. Peace returned slowly. That experience taught me something important. Most property disputes are not really about land. They are about limits. Some people believe confidence can replace documentation. Others think public pressure can overpower quiet facts. But eventually, reality narrows down to records, boundaries, and responsibility. I never wanted a public fight. I only wanted the same protection every landowner expects. In the end, the lake stayed exactly what it had always been. Private property cared for by the people who built it, and the law confirmed that clearly enough for everyone to finally hear it.